So the first part, you have to go to the first part of your handout. And what you'll see in there is we're going to start with our real estate section. And like I said, I'll just keep talking until the food shows up. First part today is really kind of on the topic of land values. More importantly, the market value of land. Who's paying for what? We have a sponsor for lunch. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening kind of here in the local market. I thought that'd be a good way. Plus, as everyone knows, there is no free lunch, right? So, a little bit on the real estate. What we'll do is we'll kind of start at the state level. We'll step down to the district level. And then we're going to step down to the farm and ranch examples. Okay? All right, so just by a show of hands, and I wasn't listening in on Al's presentation, I'm assuming we got cropland here, right? Dry land, cropland, irrigated. We got any grazing land? Okay. Anybody like to eat beef here? That's right. If you didn't raise your hand, the exit, no. Okay. All right, we're the beef state. Beef, cattle, Cornhuskers, all the good stuff. So a little bit on farm real estate. I don't know, is there a way to kill the lights up here, Al? I don't know. Hopefully, so a little bit on real estate. In the state of Nebraska, there's two different places you can find real estate information. One comes from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The other one comes from the USDA. Each year, we survey people working in the land industry. The second Wednesday of March of 2021 was when we released the preliminary estimates for the 2021 growing season. In 2022, so the upcoming growing season for crops or grazing land or whatever you might have, those will be published the second Wednesday of March, 2022. Okay? Now, I will give you some ideas on how to estimate cash rents for 2022, but we aren't quite there yet, right? You got to tell me what the price of corn is, and then I'll tell you what the price of things should be. The final report comes out in June. That has additional details beyond things like what percent of land in Nebraska is paid via contract for deed, cash sale, whatever, those kind of things. If you do the computer deal, the website link is there. If you don't do the computer thing, stop by your local extension office. Here for Saunders County, it's just right down the hall. Lancaster has one out at the county building. You can stop by even the agricultural economics department on campus and they can run you off a copy. If you want to know where the Ag Econ department is, find the dairy store, you will have found it. Okay? All right, so in the state of Nebraska, how many counties do we have? Yeah, the lights are great now. How many counties do we have in this state?
93.
That's right, 93 counties. 45 million acres of land. We have more irrigated cropland in this state than anywhere else in the United States, including Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, California. Seeing a lot of irrigation development in a report that I read last week along the Mississippi Delta right now, of all places. About half our state, a little over half of it, is in grazing land or hayland that supports the cattle industry. The other half is cropland, right? And which county are we in today? Saunders County, right. So we're in the East District. Does anyone own a property somewhere else in the greater part of the state? Okay, where are you two?
Southeast, Clay County.
Clay County, okay. So Southeast District, let's pick on your county for a second. Clay and Knuckles. Clay County is right on the border with, three other districts, right? Knuckles County right next to Webster, right down here by Kansas. If you do own a property that's right on the county line right here, it might follow the trends of the south or the east a little bit more. These aren't perfectly drawn. These districts, some people, if you read the news, they talk about crop reporting districts. They're now called agricultural statistic districts, but they're just a subdivision of the state based on what is common for that area. Okay? So in our examples, we'll kind of focus on the east and the southeast. Saunders County is right in the heart of the East District. Gage County, which includes Beatrice, over to Richardson County. Clay and Knuckles is about as far west in the Southeast District as you can go. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about land values. When we value something, there are different ways to value it. There are different definitions of value. Everybody knows when you get your property taxes, there's a value associated with that, right? It's called the assessed value. When you talk about Allan Vyhnalek's farm and ranch succession and transition, you talk about the market value at a point in time. If you stand to inherit an asset, you would value that property at that person's passing, or maybe the day after it. Okay, it's a point in time. Here at the university, we value the market value of land as of February 1, 2021, compared to February 1st, 2020. Okay, it's always at a point in time. I bet something that many people in this room have noticed is if you're in the market to buy vehicles, well, first of all, there's probably not a lot of them on the lots. And my vehicle, I was offered more than I paid for it 3 years ago because it has to do with supply and demand. People have money, do not have money. How do you finance those debts? What do we notice when we look at the state? Well, it looks like things are up slightly, right? You know, here in the southeast and east, 5 to 8%. We like to see gradual changes over time. When we start getting these huge swings, 20% up, 20% down, that's not good for anyone. Purdue University does a survey very similar to Nebraska for the state of Indiana. And if you remember, Indiana has some very nice farmland, but they also have some farmland that's somewhat rough. When they issued their report in early August, they estimated the market value of land year over year for August compared to August of the prior year was up 14%. Is that a good thing? Depends how much you got to sell, right? No. Well, when we start seeing those swings, you got to kind of evaluate what's happening. So overall for the state, the value of land was not quite $2,900. And if you take the value of the land, this is a big chart. The big chart's almost taller than I am, right? If you take the historic value of land since 1979, so you look over the last 40 years to 2021 on the far right, the value of land is the blue line. The red line is the marketing year average price of corn. Put the price of cattle, wheat, soybeans, whatever commodity that's legal to currently raise in this state, right? You got to say legal because of our neighbors now. Whatever you're talking about, prices are much better than they were a year ago, especially compared to, say, about 18 months, 16 months. I think it was July of 2020 when prices really kind of bottomed out. But the value of what we do, okay, so I just throw up the price of corn because we are the corn huskers, right? Go Big Red. Cattle, corn huskers, that's the 3 C's of our economy, right? But if you think about it for a minute, you know, a lot of operators in the state have been doing a great job navigating the production of this stuff. It's been that dimension of price that we're struggling to figure out. And I'll give you an example in the tail end of my slides that if you tell me the price, I can give you some estimated cash rents, okay? So year over year, you know, we're up not quite 10% in this state, but things are up year over year, okay? The other thing to note, the last time we seen a peak was back in 2013 and 2014, and then we've seen a slight decline over time. Not a lot. Remember, I said we like to see gradual changes. When we see this business where it's, you know, 20, 25% year over year, it's hard to forecast that stuff. And it's hard if you're a banker or someone engaged in the land industry. We don't like to see that. We like to see gradual changes over time. We've seen a gradual decline, and we're seeing a little uptick. My guess is if things hold steady, we'll probably see another uptick next year. Could it be 5 to 10%? Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Now, when we talk about assessed value for land taxation, that's a 3-year median ag land value. So the county assessor in the state of Nebraska, they look at the last 3 years of land sales, highest to lowest, okay? And they're going to pick the number that's in the middle. So when you get your notice this late fall or early winter and you're looking at the last 3 years of sales, those sales, kind of almost a little bit of a historic value, those sales might be somewhat dated compared to where things are at. And if you are watching the news with the different things that get debated at the state legislature, I would challenge you to think about this chart, and don't think about your land, but what does that policy change mean for the entire state? Okay, you can make a small change, it can make a big difference when you got 45 million acres, right? Not quite, almost 45. Okay, and the other thing that we have up here is the cost of borrowing money. Now we have the historic Treasury yield rate. The Treasury yield, or some people call it the T-bill. If you read the newspaper, sometimes they use a T-bill acronym. The reason I throw that up here is it's just an indication of long-term interest rates. If you want to talk about a downward trend, talk about interest rates. You can't go lower than 0, can you? Well, they did it in Europe. Think about that. A negative interest rate. You think your interest rates are terrible on what you got deposited now? If you put in $100 in some of the banks in Europe, when they were doing the negative interest rates, and you went back at the end of the year, you might have $97. You had to pay them to hold your money. They were trying to get people to spend, right? Same mentality here. When we have low interest rates, we're trying to incentivize people to go buy, to borrow money and to buy. You're trying to stimulate, right? Now you can do this, but the problem you get is something where your dollar doesn't go as far. What is that? I'm sure everybody here has noticed this. Cost of food, cost of materials. Agricultural equipment, steel. One of my hobbies on our farm is to build stuff out of steel. You would be amazed to see how much steel prices are now. Just raw steel, a piece of square tubing. It's just crazy. Inflation, right? Now, how do you combat inflation? Well, they did it once. They did it back in the 1980s. What'd they do? Big, tall guy, 6'7", Paul Volcker, raised the interest rates. Now, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, once again, in life, it depends. If you get anything out of my talk, it always depends. Did you have the money or do you have to borrow it? Well, obviously, there was a lot of hardship in the ag community because when you raise interest rates, the cost to do things. I mean, could you imagine being a farmer right now doing a budget at 14% interest? Wouldn't work too well. So, long-term interest rates are down, and if I'm in the market to go out and buy things, and I have so much a year budgeted to go towards satisfying a land payment, can I afford to pay more or less if I'm paying, say, 3.5% for 30 years or 6.5%? Well, you can probably afford to pay more with the lower interest rates, right? So that kind of summarizes what is happening with the land industry. Margins tend to be quite favorable over the last year. Now, input expenses are a different deal for 2022, but margins, at least on the crop side, appear to be better. And now as I said, for 2021, remember 2022, we got to secure seed, fertilizer, chemicals. A lot of those are much higher than they were. And we also have to think about prices. Where are they going? Okay. Let's see. A few things to note. Depending upon what year you're in, remember I said assessments are based off a 3-year median ag land value. Farm Bureau did a little report last February, and when they took a look at it, depending upon what county you were in, your 2020 assessment that was due in 2021, if your county was in green, it meant that the assessments went up. It might have been a very small amount, but they went up. And if they were in red, the assessed value overall for the county might have gone down a little bit. Well, hold on a second. Remember, with your property tax bill, there's two components. You have the assessed value on ag land at 75% of the assessed value. And you also have that thing called the mill levy. The mill levy, there's a little discretion in which the mill levy is taxed at. So if you see this map up here and your county's in red and you say, Jim, well, my taxes were just as high or maybe even they went up a little bit. Keep in mind there's discretion at the county level that as long as the mill levy is in the legally permittable area, even if the values back off 0.6%, you can still hold them steady or maybe even increase them. a lot of the mill levies in certain areas, they hold them at a fairly low level because year over year you keep seeing those increases, right? So there's a two-dimension thing there. And, we can't forget about talking about the horses. What do we care about the horses for? Well, if you voted last November, which I hope you did, we obviously had a federal as well as a state election. And I believe there were 5 ballot propositions on the state election that we had to vote on. 3 of them related to racetrack facilities and legalizing gambling at those places. Beyond gambling and the taxes generated from that, there was an act in there that specified where the gambling proceeds were going to be going from the tax funds. They're going towards, and it's specified in there, a small credit, which when you filed your state of Nebraska income tax credit, which hopefully if you had income, you filed taxes, right? Right? Yes. If you don't, you may not want to give your name out. But when you filed your taxes, there was a small state of Nebraska income tax credit. And that's not going to be a huge number this year. But there's a small credit that offsets a portion of your property taxes. And where that was coming from was a bill that when we start gambling or when gambling starts in the state, some of the proceeds from that are being funneled through what is occurring here. Okay? So make sure if you own residential or agricultural land in this state, just be aware that there's a small tax credit. I think when I read an article for a house in Bellevue that was worth, say, $200,000, I think the credit was around $120. Remember, a credit goes against your direct tax liability. It's not a deduction, but it's a credit for your state of Nebraska income tax credit. Okay? So if you have ag land, obviously ag land, your land holding is probably worth, who knows, $1 million or something. Okay. So I haven't seen anything on lunch if it's here yet or not. You want to check on that, Al? That's okay. Talk a little bit, when you look through your handouts, and I won't highlight all these, when you look through your handouts, you'll see there's different land values in there. A different land value is referred to as a land class, and we published, I believe, there's 7 or 8 different types of land. The value of what we have relates to the value of what we can do. So we notice here for dry land cropland, and in your handout you'll have dry land cropland without irrigation potential, and dry land cropland with irrigation potential. If it does not have irrigation potential, what that means is you can't develop it because either the water is not there or policies in the area do not allow for it. Southeast Nebraska led the state. Other areas, 5, 6. Some areas not quite as much. But the price of corn, soybeans, many of the common things we had raised in the eastern third as well as other areas of the state, things appear to be much better than they were. So a few things to know in the handout. If you remember, we talked about the historic perspective on what is happening to the market value of land in Nebraska. We mentioned there was dry land cropland, grazing land, and irrigated cropland. On the topic of grazing land, remember I said the value of what we have relates to the value of what's legally permissible with it, right? Well, you notice in grazing land, you're starting to see 1%, 2%. I mean, yes, there's cropland here, but there's some big areas up here that have a lot of grazing land. We're seeing in certain areas that the grazing land hasn't increased quite as much as what the cropland, the irrigated, or the dry land cropland has. Okay? The highest priced land value that we have reported in the state of Nebraska, and it's the highest prices that are in the East District, is for center pivot irrigated cropland. So what feeds into the value of irrigated cropland? Quality of the land, how does it sit? Water. What kind of water rights do you have associated with your ground if you do have that? From where I grew up, they have some of these wells that they sink in the ground that are almost 800 foot deep. You can get the water, but it gets really, really rusty, right? and it requires a ton of upkeep, but you can get the water if you look for it. The highest priced irrigated land sales that we've had coming in are all along Interstate 80. That's kind of the area. I would say follow from Fremont out to about York or Grand Island, kind of the north side of the interstate. That's the major places we're seeing the. So center pivot irrigated cropland, the highest priced, the highest real estate. Some of the highest priced sales beyond some of the things our guest mentioned today are coming in from some of the areas where we grow commercial seed corn in this state. Seward, York, all the way out to Kearney. The value of what we have relates to the value of what we're doing on it. Typically, the margins on commercial seed corn production might be better than what traditional corn, soybean, wheat, whatever kind of crop you could grow out there, right? The other big thing that has been influencing farm real estate values, the value of what we do, interest rates, and disaster payments. Disaster payments in the last 18 months have been exceptional because we've been trying to navigate a period of time with all the uncertainty that has not been easy. All the PP programs, the Paycheck Protection Program, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, and the tail end of the marketing facilitation payments. I don't know the exact amount, but you're probably talking something close to the billions. All right, so if you're from where you're seated, if you see the slide that's up on the screen, you'll see it's a horizontal bar chart. The way to read this is you'll see if the lines are on the right-hand side, the people that took our survey back in last winter, late last winter, early last spring, they were saying for the upcoming year, do they anticipate land values will be declining, which these are the declining, and if they're increasing, they're on the right-hand side. What do we notice? They're all on that side on your right-hand side from where you're seated. What are leading to higher prices? Well, many of the things that we've expressed here in the last 15, 20 minutes. Crop prices, interest rates, purchases for farm expansion, 1031 exchange, okay? Things weighing down on the real estate market, negative forces relative to other areas in the United States. Property taxes, property tax policies. Input expenses were not positive, but there's concern on some of those issues that are a little dicey to kind of work our way through sometimes. So I would anticipate if we do this chart, if we redid it today, we would see something very similar to this with respect to where do we anticipate the values will be going. I would anticipate higher and the higher because some of the reasons we have up there. Now how high it goes, I think the big things, what are the margins on the crops or cattle or whatever do you have? And where are interest rates going? If we see higher interest rates because of concerns about inflation, 3.5%, 3.75 for a 30-year ag land loan, if that all of a sudden became 6.5 or 8.5, that would definitely have an influence on some of these things. Okay? All right, anything else for questions? I know we kind of discussed a few over lunch. Let's get started on the cash rents. So remember, I said we kind of start at the statewide average for land values. Next, we're going to step down to the district, down to the county, and then down to the farm. So with respect to regional cash rents, you'll see that the eastern part of the state, the values kind of tend to trend together. The western two-thirds, it's a little bit different. And a few things. When you start looking at the percent change year over year, keep in mind what was the base value. If you're in northwest Nebraska and it went up 9-10%, well, that's, $2.85 an acre, $3 an acre. If you're here in the East District and you go up 7% on 220, that's a lot different. Does everybody kind of follow that? The newspapers love to grab these headlines where they say that they pick the highest percent change. Well, you got to keep in mind what was that value, right? The breakdown on cash rents, we have what is referred to as HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the low grade, and an average of all the responses. So what I mean by this is, say for example, here in the Southeast District or the East District, the upper third of cash rental rates in 2021 was $195 an acre or 240. The lower third of cash rental rates was 175 or 130, and an average of all the responses were 220 and 170. Okay, so that's how it breaks down. We just ask, what do you estimate the upper third, the lower third, or the average cash rent is? And that's how we figure out those numbers. Now, what influences these cash rents? Many of the things Allan talked about. Productivity of the soil, is it drained well? Do you have a ditch cutting the property up? What else? Local competitiveness of the area. How far are you from competing farming interests? Whatever. Another source of cash rental rate information comes from the USDA. The USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and I think I've seen a few faces here that I've explained this to once. The USDA with NASS has a division that they survey producers as well as landowners and people of that nature on different issues. One of the issues that they typically survey in odd-numbered years, and they happen to do it in 2020, and they will be publishing the update for 2021, I expect by Friday of this week, is their county-level cash rent survey. And if you want to find the website where you can find it, if you type in this giant link right here, it will take you to the updated 2021 rates when they get posted. In your handouts, before you start squinting too much, you'll see this slide right here. I want you to mark where you're at, and if you go to the back end of your handout, you'll see that the dry land, so dry land would be non-irrigated, irrigated, and grazing land, cash rental rates on a per acre basis are published there. And also, I believe on the bottom of those slides, I believe I put it in the website where you can find them. I say these are the cookie cutter slides. So a few things to know about. The rates that you have in your current handouts are for 2020. Why do I put them there? Well, at least it kind of gives you some indication of, you might remember where you were at in 2020 or what the cash equivalent would have been on your property if you were a crop shareholder. But you can also get some ideas on how cash rental rates. Okay, so for our guests here today that are from the Southeast District where they own land, you'll see that cash rental rates, it almost looks like the upper third of cash rents are in some of these counties along the Iowa border. Some of these here in the more central area might be closer to the average, the regional average. You remember some of these numbers? In the lower third of cash rent, they tend to come in some of these counties. The farther west you move in a district, they tend to be in those areas. Why? Well, especially on the dry land, it has to do with the rainfall, right? Once again, these are updated in typically the second week of September for the current growing year. This information from the University of Nebraska will be updated once again the second Wednesday of March 2022 for the upcoming 2022 season. Yes, sir?
Are those cash rental rates, these surveys, are they from farm managers? Who else are they from?
All right. So a question, you got a good question here. Where does this stuff come from? Oops, where does this come from? If you notice, things to note. This survey is a survey of actual farmers, farm and ranchers, okay? Their survey is done a little bit later in the growing season, I believe, than what the University of Nebraska does, and it's conducted, and I think they shut the survey off in July. People that respond to the University of Nebraska survey are what I call land industry professionals. Land brokers, farm managers, agricultural bankers, appraisers, other people that work the land, people that would have firsthand knowledge on different things related to transactions. Are these numbers better than the USDA numbers? I simply say they're all estimates. If you don't have an estimate, what do you have to go off of, right? So I'm not saying their information is right or wrong. It's just a different source of it, okay? And what I would do if I was in your seat, if you're an operator or somebody that's looking to rent your ground to someone, how does your property stack up against some of these numbers, okay? I think Allan says it in his talk. When you talk about your land, how is your land relative to the regional average, Okay? A few things. On the irrigated rental rates, the center pivot and as well as the gravity irrigated rates are reported by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The USDA does not report rental rates on a per acre basis for the two irrigated types. They only report one. With the center pivot rates here in the southeast and the east, it was around 280 to 290. The breakdown on the cash rental rates were from a high third average of 330 down to 310. For the upper third, the lower third was from 250 down to 240. What influences irrigated rental rates? Well, everything we talked about on the dry land, but what else? Quality of the water. Do you have any issues getting to the water? Do you have restrictions on it? Do you have an irrigation system that you can turn on and off with one of these things or a computer or something like that? Or you have to physically go out there and throw the power on or get the ether can out and start the diesel engine up, right? We all know how that goes. All those things influence the rate, and the UNL as well as the USDA assume that the landowner or the landowner entity owns the entire system, pivot, pump, power unit. If you do not own one of those things, you would account for that in the rental rate. On the USDA rates, you're going to note a few things. Here in the southeast, we got the southeast corner of the state, much higher rainfall than in other areas. Another thing is, there's not a lot of water there at the rate that would be necessary to support irrigation. So that's why those counties are in white. If there's other areas that are in white, obviously there's not a lot of irrigated cropland out in the sandhills, or you can get into areas where they just couldn't get enough people to respond to produce a number with confidence. If you own a property along the interstate here where there's still a lot of flood or gravity irrigation, they create kind of a weighted average. So gravity irrigation tends to run anywhere from about $30 to $50 an acre less than what center pivot does. So they kind of create a weighted average to account for that. Okay? All right, a few things on grazing land. You can rent by the acre or you can rent by the pair. It doesn't matter how you rent it. What matters is how much do I have to write the check out for, or how much might you be willing to accept for the cash rent. The cash rental rates on a per acre basis tend to reflect the stocking rate. How many acres does it take for one cow-calf pair? In southeast Nebraska, the average was $49 an acre. In the East District, it was $53. And the breakdown right here was from 42 to 59, 40 to 72. I know there's not a lot of people here with grazing land, but I'll make a few comments. What influences the grazing land cash rental rates? A few things. Quality of the land, how does it lay? Fencing. Who's responsible for the upkeep of the fencing? Brush, weed control, all these things. I think Allan mentioned different things you could talk about or negotiate in a lease. And who's responsible for that? The landlord or the tenant? It's exactly right. It is the other party, correct? You think about that. If you're a landlord or a tenant, I'll always tell you this other party. Well, what I'm joking about is whoever always thinks it's the other person, right? The point in doing all this discussions on lease topics is depending on who has the skill set, time, equipment, whatever, can you negotiate that into the lease to come up with a rental rate that is equitable? Okay? Few comments on the cow-calf pair rental rates. For one cow, one calf, for 1 month during the traditional summer grazing season, southeast Nebraska was not quite $55. Then in the eastern Nebraska, it was just a shade over. So if you rent for 5 months, and if you took 55 times 5, you would be around about $275 a pair. Okay? So if somebody says, I want to rent it this way, but my landlord wants it on a per acre basis, can you start doing the math to say, okay, I can put 30 pairs out on this property. I'm going to have to pay so much a month times 5 months, divide it by the number of acres to back out a per acre estimate. Okay, as everybody can understand, you got to be able to play both sides of the game sometimes. Okay. Any questions on the cash rents? I want to talk a little bit about leases, and then we'll do the carbon credits. Go ahead.
I know that can vary, but what are you using for an average per acres for trailers? How many acres?
Okay, so the question is, how many acres does it take to support one cow, one calf for the summer grazing season in this area or wherever, right? The thing I would comment to you, you got Connor right here in Saunders County, and I believe he covers the southeast corner of the state. He'd be a good resource to visit with your local beef educator, and they can give you some estimates on some of those numbers. I'm not going to attempt. The best thing, a lot of people keep records on your property to keep it in. Okay, I put 30 pairs out there this year, but it was kind of dry. Okay, well, learn from that and make the adjustments this year. So maybe it should be 25 pair, 27 pair, whatever. The old rancher's adage of graze half, leaf half, I think is a thing that holds true to just about anywhere in the state. Did you have a question? No, okay. Okay. 3 ideas on setting cash rents, and I've used these in prior years, but I updated some of the examples, and I think there's some really good estimates in here. We went through a bunch of survey information on cash rent. How do I take that and apply it down to my farm that I want to rent to someone or I want to rent out to someone? The second idea is called cash equivalent from crop share. Many people here are familiar with the crop share, but they may not like the idea of a crop share because you have to try to market that grain or sell whatever. What would you be willing to take for cash rent? The final idea is return on investment. Remember, land is an investment, and every investment has a return. What are the current returns? We'll give you some ideas. Okay, so here we start with the first idea. I got a made-up county here. In my made-up county, I said that the average county rental rate per acre is $135 an acre. And let's say in this county, we figured out the average yield was 120 bushel per acre. If you take the county rental rate per acre and divide it by the average yield, you get what is referred to as the county rent per bushel. The county rent per bushel, what that says in this made-up example, $1.13 per bushel on average is going towards paying what? The cash rent. Okay? Is $1.13 a bushel very much if the price of corn is $5 a bushel? That's not too bad. What about if it's $2.80 a bushel? That's what it was in July of 2020. Things didn't look so good for a while back then. If you take the county rental rate per bushel and slide it to the upper right-hand corner, and let's say a property that I'm looking to rent or one that I took over that I have to rent out to somebody, if I looked at the crop insurance history and I said, okay, over the last 5 years, it typically yields about 105 bushel per acre. Take the county rent per bushel times it by the average yield, you get the farm level cash rent. The farm level cash rent, what it says is, on average, this property, using all these numbers, would rent for about $118 an acre. Taking into account, it yields about 15 bushel per acre less than what the county does. Okay? If it yielded 128 bushel, you would adjust the cash rent up. You take what you know and you apply it to a situation where you don't necessarily know it. All right? All right, here's another idea. So a lot of people like the idea of a crop share. They like the idea of a crop share because they feel that it is equitable. Everybody notice I didn't use the F word in front of everyone. I'm being recorded today. What's the F word related to rent?
Fair.
Fair. You're exactly right. Make sure you edit that out, Ryan, right? They really are putting this up online. What is the word fair? It's 4 letters long. It starts with F, and we don't say 4-lettered F words when we're getting recorded, correct? What is fair? Well, it's a sense of judgment. Where do you go to church? What job do you have? Who'd you marry? What kind of job do they have? How much land did their parents own? Whatever, right? Notice You inherit stuff. What is equitable is taking into account what you produce, taking out the pertinent expenses, and what do you make off it. A lot of older landowners report that they like the idea of a crop share, but they don't like the idea of having to market it. You got to navigate that, and that's not an easy thing. In this made-up example, the soybeans actually yielded a little over 50 bushel per acre, I believe 52 bushel. Landlord gets half the crop, the tenant gets half the crop. Now, in addition to a 50-50 split, the landlord entity would be paying half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses traditionally under a 50-50 split, the big three: seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. I actually used a UNL budget to pull some of these numbers in this made-up example. The difference between the landlord's share of the income minus the landlord's share of expenses is what they intend to make from this crop share. Now, I did not take off property taxes, because even if you're getting cash rent, you still have to pay property taxes if you want to keep owning your land, right? So this was in March. Okay, in March we figured it around 170 bushel or $170 an acre. Then in July, holding everything constant except for prices, we estimated the cash rent should be a little bit higher because prices were better. And then we get into November, and I just picked a number here, prices were down. We estimated it not quite at $200 an acre. So out of March, July, and November, what is the fair cash rental rate? Well, if you're a landlord, it's option B, right? July. I would argue that the fair or the equitable cash rental rate accounts for what were prices really, or what could you market them at using your strategy, and what did the property actually yield. Out of yield, price, and input expenses, the only one you're going to know for sure this fall is probably your inputs, right? Now, a lot of people are starting to talk about locking some of these things down, and I think this number is going to be a lot higher this upcoming year. Its yield, I can tell you, certain areas of the state are very dry, other areas have been very good. It just completely depends where you're at. So what is equitable accounts for both of them. If you're on the grazing land side of the deal, say you have some native grass, or say you have a property that, like the one corner of the field is too steep to farm, but you just let it in brome grass or a cool season grass. You want to figure out what should you rent the property for. Well, in this example, the field actually yielded 2.5 tons per acre. Maybe you only cut it once a year. And the landlord could put it up on share. Could do a 1/3, 2/3 split right here in the center, or he could do a 50-50 split. Under a 1/3, 2/3 split, this is how much hay the landlord would get. A 50-50 split, they would get 1.25 tons per acre. But under a 50-50 split, if you threw $20 of nitrogen out there per acre, you'd probably take off 125 minus 10 to give you 115 an acre. Okay? Why I like this example is, depending upon what the property yields or what the hay is valued at, which at the time when this example was put together, good quality, good to premium quality grass hay was easily worth $100 a ton. Why? Things are dry this year and we got to figure out something to feed stuff. The other reason I use two different examples here, it just goes to show you what the cash equivalent from the share would be. Varies depending upon what the actual yield is and what it's actually worth. Final idea, return on investment. Every investment has a return. Sometimes the return is really good, sometimes it's not quite as good. If you know what the market value of land is and times it by the rate of return, the market value times the rate of return gives you the estimated cash rent. Okay? If you want to know why land values have increased so much, if you take the rate of return, so your cash rent, and if instead of multiplying the market value times this number, if you divide it by it, so if you take 120 and divide it by 2.4, that can give you the market value, right? That's why when interest rates gets so low or cash rental rates go up so much, we start seeing higher market values on the market value of land. A lot of bankers use this example when they got to do their financial statements for producers and some of that kind of thing. If you have a situation where the tenant provides the pivot and the landlord does not, how much do you take off the cash rent? This pie chart right here breaks that down. About 2/3 of the time, the landlord takes off somewhere between $20 to $50 an acre off the center pivot irrigated cash rent. A little over less than 1/3 of the time, it's between $10 to $25 an acre or less. I think something that's a little bit more common is if the tenant provides the energy system, the thing that's pumping the water, diesel engine, propane, natural gas engine, or an electric motor, how much do you take off the cash rent to account for the tenant providing that? About 1/3 of the time, it's between 1 to 9. The other 1/3 of the time, it's between 10 to 20 bucks an acre. The thing you'll notice on the diesel engines, and it's becoming more and more pertinent as time goes on, they take off even more. Why? Any ideas? The environmental emission control stuff. Newer diesel engines, the larger diesel engines, you have to put by that high depth emission system. Those systems are expensive to buy, and they're expensive to maintain over time relative to the engines that didn't have that stuff on it. Final piece here. So this area of the state back in 2019, we suffered from a lot of flooding. The question on our survey was, did you have any provisions in your lease to account for that flooding? Overwhelmingly, you'll see the blue region on that pie chart, most people did not. Forget about flooding, replace it with drought or hail or some other kind of event that occurs because of weather or something. Do you have a provision in your lease to account for disaster? Overwhelmingly, when it came to that disaster provision in 2019, about 1/3 of people made no adjustments in their lease if they had an extensive prevent plan. A little over another 1/3 cut the rent down, or around 20% did something else. They maybe abandoned the property, put it into CRP, something to that effect. Moving forward, though, we still had a fair number of people report that they did not address fully disaster in the lease to account for it. But I encourage you to think about it. In the last 10 to 15 years, you've seen drought, you've seen flooding, and drought again. How do you design a lease that makes it equitable for both parties involved? If you do not have a lease in writing, I think Allan highlights this in his slides. I'll just highlight it one more time. The website is aglease101.org. It's a great place to find a free fill-in-the-form PDF lease. There's absolutely no charge for it. And also on this website, if you're renting out a building or something of that nature, how much do you rent it out for? Or how much? There's a building rental rate survey. My comment on buildings are you tend to rent them on a per square foot basis, so many cents or dollars per square foot per year. Oh, if you like the stuff you're seeing today, Allan and I host an online video recording once a business quarter. We have one coming up here in November, a couple weeks before Thanksgiving. We're going to be talking a little bit about USDA farm program payments, as well as the 2021, that county level cash rental rate map. I'll be highlighting it on there. Allan will be talking about closing out leases, what do we need to be thinking about from 2021 and 2022. And any upcoming land management meetings we have planned, if you want to come for another one or if you want to send somebody you know to one, hopefully we'll be able to be hosting them this winter given COVID and all that kind of thing. All right, any questions? Yes?
What about crop insurance? At least the way we do it now, I do a crop share, but I cover my own crop insurance and the tenant covers his own. So that's our own built-in mechanism to deal with disasters.
You bet. And it gets to this example here too. When you're on a crop share, it's your right, but not requirement, to be able to take out crop insurance or to participate in any kind of federal farm program payments of any kind as well. And that's a great way to handle disaster. We had cases like in Dodge County. It just wasn't that the property was wet and you couldn't plant it on time. It was the property was wet, plus there was 6 inches of sand scattered across the entire thing. You know, stuff like that. Or you had extreme drought, and by the middle of July, the pasture was this tall, and you had another 2 months left on the lease. How do you handle that? Yeah. The old rancher's adage of graze half, leaf half, it still holds true for whatever year. Yeah, next question.
On the crop share versus cash rent, what percent of your estimate of total farm to cash rent versus some sort of crop share?
Yeah, so for the people that are watching this online, if you couldn't hear the question, it basically had to do with what percent of leases are crop share versus cash lease or even a flex share, right? We actually did this a couple of years ago, and I didn't have it in the slide. I think in the eastern part of the state, you know, you're talking around a third are crop share. The remaining balance, you know, 60, 70% are either a cash lease or a cash lease with like a bushel rent or a flex lease or some of those kind of things. Much more higher occurrence of crop share the farther west you go, especially when you got out in like the panhandle. Why is that? Because, well, you have a lot more extremes in the weather the farther west you go in the United States. So, okay.
My comments today are going to be on communication, succession, negotiation, and lease provisions. I know I probably should put lease communication and lease provisions together, but I think trying to intersperse them a little bit maybe helps and causes me to remember things I better talk about. Lease communications are interesting because I think that I don't know what the number is exactly. I'm making stuff up probably if I give a number, but the vast majority, like in 85 to 92, 93% of the range, leases are doing fine with the landlord and the tenant. In other words, the landlord and tenant are communicating great and they get along with each other great. They get along great. And then the other 5 to 10% where things go to haywire, they're the ones that call me. I get those calls. I don't get the calls where everything's going great. I get the calls where everything's gone to heck in a handbasket. And when that lease has had a problem, it's almost always because of no communication or lack of communication or poor communication. Mostly no communication. Just understand that. And in just over a majority, I would say over half, just over half, understand that it's family involved. Family in the lease. That's the crazy part. We're not talking to family, our own family. We don't want to share anything with our own family. So understand that when you're working with your family, you have a business agreement, that's this lease that you have on farm ground, and you have a family. So let's make the commitment we're going to have a family, keep the family together, and then work on this at a different time or as you need to see fit. Yes, sir?
Sorry to stop you. It's page 12 is where this
12, okay, sorry, page 12.
Yeah, you have the same
All right,
slide.
where I'm starting is on page 12. Thank you. All right, I apologize. I should have looked that up before we got going. Now, what we don't do in communication is we don't stop to listen. We do not stop to listen. We should seek first to understand and to be understood, and we should ask clarifying questions. We have to prove to the other party that you've heard what they're saying. Okay, so let me prove that to you. Would you play along with me for a moment, sir? Okay, say loud enough so people in the room can kind of hear, and I'll kind of repeat it for the recording. So, what do you plan to do this evening? Do you have any plans for, what is it, a Wednesday night? Tell me what you're doing on a Wednesday night.
I'm celebrating my wife's birthday today.
All right. You know what? That's cool and that's awesome, but you know what? I'm going to have a great Wednesday night because my daughter-in-law found us tickets to go to the Nebraska Creighton volleyball game up at CHI tonight, and we're going to enjoy that because it's just going to be a Donnybrook. As a matter of fact, I am not sure that Nebraska will win. I think Creighton's going to have a heck of a team and put up a heck of a fight, and I think it's just going to be, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that doesn't go to 5 sets. And we're trying to decide now when we want to leave and if we're going to go up early and have lunch up to some early supper up there or whatever. The match starts at 6:30 on Fox Sports 1. All right, so let's review this conversation we just had. Why did I ask him the question? Because I wanted to talk about what I was going to do. because I'm excited about going to the volleyball tonight, okay? I didn't ask him to find out about him. If we're going to listen, if we're going to communicate, we have to listen. If we're going to listen, we can't talk about ourselves, we have to talk about them. So let's start the conversation over again. What are you going to do tonight? What's going on in your life tonight?
Going to celebrate my wife's birthday.
Oh yeah, so your wife's birthday is actually today? Yeah, good. So how do you celebrate your wife's birthday? What do you tend to do? How do you do that typically?
Actually, I've got a buddy of mine that's got the same year car that I had, 1967 Chevelle.
67 Chevelle.
And then he's going to swing by our place, and we're going to go ride around for an hour.
You're going to go ride around in the old Chevelle, 67 Chevelle. Two-door or four-door?
This is a two-door. I had a four-door, but this is the one I kind of really wanted. This type, you know.
Automatic or stick? Automatic or stick?
It's four on the floor, yeah.
A 4 on the floor, all right. Is it 327 or 396?
It's 327.
327, all right, very good. Yeah. 2-barrel, 4-barrel?
4-barrel.
There you go. See? I could even talk in 67 terms. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to know all that stuff. So what did I say about my plan? In that second conversation, what did I say about my plans for tonight? Nothing. If you want to communicate properly, you listen. And you ask more questions. So I keep asking him questions? Absolutely. I kept asking him, what are you going to do? What does that look like? What is that car going to be? You just go down the path and make them feel appreciated. If they feel appreciated, then they'll work with you on stuff. If you never listen and don't show appreciation, how are you going to get anywhere? That's the point. Pay attention. Look at who's talking. Do not talk. Let them talk. Ask questions. Follow directions. And visualize what's being said. We'll make a couple of key errors when we're talking and having conversations with people. One key error is the one I pointed out already. I don't ask them a question to find out what they think. I ask them a question to tell them what I think. Okay. I think I'm going to go to volleyball tonight. The second key error is we are listening, but we're listening with the intent of replying rather than asking a question. You're saying something, and I want to reply, and my Chevelle was blue. What color was this car? You know, all right? Do you know what I'm trying to say? I had a 71, too. I had a 71. All right. Now, but the second error is we're thinking about what we would say back to that as a response rather than asking them more questions, whether it's 4 on the floor, that sort of thing. All right. Now, the third mistake we make is that when somebody's describing a problem, we automatically think we ought to fix it. And I'm telling you that's not necessarily helpful. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So the bottom line is, how many times have you tried to fix something when your wife or your spouse or your kids describe something to you? I do it all the time. That's my number one mistake. And I just have to always stop and always stop, listen to them, ask clarifying questions. And then if they ask me, what would you do? Then I can offer a solution. Until they say, what would you do? They're not ready. They probably want to vent. They probably want to describe their problem or their issue. So it's not about the nail. In communication on leases and communication on farm succession stuff, but specifically I'm going to talk about leases here for a minute. Force yourself to share the information with the landlord if you're a tenant. Do I have any tenants here today? I got lots of landlords. Do I have any tenants at all? Any farmers? Okay. All right. Thank you. And some of you are both. I mean, some of you can be both a tenant and a landlord. But for the tenants, even for a cash lease, you should probably share information with the landlord. And because the landlords feel like they don't have enough information about what's going on out there. And if you have a landlord that's able to accept pictures through their phone or something like that through technology, consider sending them a text picture of what's going on. Considering taking a picture and sending it via email to them what's going on if they have email capability. But more important, right now in September, early September, when we're recording this, it's important to remember that your biggest thing is to get them outstanding in the field. As a tenant, get that landlord out to your farm and see what's going on right now, right before harvest. See where you had weed pressure. See where there's disease pressure. See how the harvest crops are doing. See what the potential yield might be. Right now is a good time for the tenant to get the landlord out to that field to see what's going on and just kind of check things out a little bit. And so be sure to tell them all year long how things are going in terms of moisture, disease, insects, weeds, and let them know how the year went, even for a cash lease. Share that information so the landlord has more information from the tenant other than just when you're renegotiating the lease. That just doesn't seem right to me. For the landlord should probably not talk to the tenant about what the cash rent might be or what the rental agreement or what the rental dollars are first. When the landlord's working with a new tenant, or especially when they're setting up a lease, the landlord ought to be sharing what they want to have as goals for that farm. Listen, my teaching in farm succession tells me that we're all not going to live forever. Our end is coming. Our demise is going to be here. We haven't figured out how to avoid that part yet. We don't have to retire, but we haven't figured out how to avoid the demise. And so the question becomes, what's my end goal here? My end job here is to leave that farm in better shape than when I got it. My end job is to have a better piece of ground or better piece of productivity, more productivity than when I received that piece of ground. And by the way, I'm a landlord too. I own farm ground and my brother farms it, and we're continually thinking about what needs to happen next in terms of making that ground more productive and what investments I'd be willing to make in terms of, like, for instance, my ground's down in Saunders County, so I'm trying to use a lot of new terracing design that includes a parallel terrace with a tile drain, a drain off the terrace so that I don't have erosion coming off that land in any way if I can help it, because it's all tiled and the tile drain takes extra water off. So we're always looking at how we're going to do those things. And if the landlord would always visit with the tenant about what they expect for weed control and erosion control and crop expectations and not crop acre management, the non-crop acres, if you have that, is an important conversation to have, because who takes care of the cedar trees? Eastern red cedar, in my view, should be one of the noxious weeds of Nebraska, but it's not yet. It's not considered to be a weed. It's a tree, but the eastern red cedar is a terrible issue. Have those conversations first and figure out the lease arrangements for money later. You have to avoid this feeling of having power over. I remember very distinctly here about 10 years ago talking to a landlord and a tenant in Platte County in the same week. The landlord calls me first. He says, the tenant has all the power in this negotiation. I don't know how to set the lease for next year. I said, why do you feel that way? Because the tenant knows exactly what that yield was, and they know exactly how to set what they're willing to pay so they can still make money given that yield. I would like to have that yield information. And so to that, I would say if a landlord feels that way, what I tell the landlords is, then you ask for yield information in that lease. That becomes a term in the lease. I want yield information. For the tenant, I had the same farm, the same piece of ground. The tenant calls me up later that week and says, the landlord has all the power in this lease. I said, why do you feel that way? Well, because if I don't pay exactly what the landlord wants by 10 o'clock this morning in terms of cash leasing arrangements, he'll just go to the coffee shop, put the word out, and by 6 tonight, there'll be at least 3 bids at my rate or higher. People even bid more. It's just insane right now, the competition there is for land. And that's continued for the 15 years that I've been doing this work. But people want to accuse me of causing cash rents to go up. They're wrong. It's everybody bidding against everybody that causes the cash rents to go up. It's still a supply and demand thing, and I have no control over that. So the first conversation for pastures and farm ground, again, should not be the price per acre, the price per pair, the price per whatever. It should be about what management is expected and what management can the tenant provide. And then if those two are in alliance, then you make the lease provisions work out. Okay, there's enough comments about communication. What to communicate. Let's talk about succession and transition just for a moment. Here's a little bit of a primer. This is about a 15-minute primer of my 2.5-hour talk that I can do on farm succession and transition, okay? Just a little bit. Are farmers ever going to retire? Survey information says no. Farmers never want to retire. Nebraska survey I did shows that 35%, 20 plus 15, have some plans to retire. But it also shows that 9 plus 24 plus 21, the second grouping there, 54% are never fully planning to retire from farming. That's over half, never going to get out. In Iowa, a newer survey done there shows that, a newer survey there says that this is almost 20%, and that's just over 50%. That's right around 70% of farmers never fully plan to get out of farming. Only about 20% do, and then there's some statistical errors there. But in other words, the overwhelming percent of farmers never plan to retire from farming. Why aren't we retiring? Because we have our baby boomer generation has a difficult time giving up control. Control is everything. And in some cases, we don't even have control yet. I know people in their 60s that still have moms and dads around in their 80s and 90s. They're mostly still managing the farm. And so when we finally get control from our parents' generation, because they lived longer, we want to have control for a while before we give it up to the next generation, even though the next generation might be in their late 30s or 40s already. And so it's an interesting issue that we have going on there. Modern farm equipment allows you to go longer because I had one farmer tell me farming is finally fun because I can go to the end of the field, turn around, push the button, and go back to the other end of the field, turn around, push the button, and go back again. All I have to do is control my speed and watch what's going on with the implement because the GPS guides the tractor. So it makes it more interesting, more a different kind of a situation. They don't want to think about retiring because it would mean that they have to think about death. They can't afford to retire. That'd be the bad news. The healthier, longer life would be the good news. Just over half don't have a successor. I'm not sure 55% is the right number. That's the number from this survey, but I'm not sure it's the right number. But just over half don't have a successor, so they don't want to quit because they don't know where the land would go to. And just over half don't know what else they do. So I'm talking to one farmer a couple of years ago, and he goes, well, I don't know what else I do. As long as I get up in the cab, I might as well keep going. And I said, so talk to me, tell me more about that. And he goes, well, if I retired, then I would need to have a hobby like woodworking or fishing or something like hunting or something like that. I don't do any of those things. I'm not going to start at this age. And I don't want to go to the bar and play cards or drink beer. That doesn't sound interesting to me. That's kind of an unproductive waste of time. And for the people that go, I'm not being critical, but I'm just telling you, this guy just didn't want to do it. And I don't want to go drink coffee, so I'm not going to go down to the coffee club every morning because I just don't drink coffee. I mean, I like to go to Husker football games, but they're not even any good anymore, so we're not going to worry about that. And so, it's just a function of what do you do, What are you going to do in retirement? As long as I can get up into the cab, I might as well just keep going. And I understand that. I am not trying to embarrass anyone into thinking they should retire. The lesson should not be on whether you're going to retire or not. The lesson should be about farm succession transition. The lesson has to be about what are you going to do with your stuff when you're gone. No one's ever been able to avoid being dead. The great demise comes for all of us sooner or later. What happens to our stuff when we're gone? That's the question. Do you want to have control over that or not? Do you want to have any input on that or not? That's the question. And so, too often, if you read this carefully, it says the underlined part says, more often than not, planning tends to be deferred until some critical life event occurs which forces the family to address the matter. In other words, somebody dies. Heart attack, stroke, car accident, tractor accident. There's a myriad of ways that people leave this earth before you intend to leave. The unexpected death. And then what have we done with the family that's remaining? We put them in distress. They're grieving. They're upset. They're sad. And now they have to decide what to do with the assets because that person didn't have a plan in place. The person that's gone now didn't have a plan, so there's no real rule or direction on the assets. I submit that if we would make the plans before we have those catastrophic events occur, we would make better plans because we're not in this stress. We're not in this grieving mode. We're not in this sad mode. We could just make the plans. And then when something happens, especially out of order or not unexpected, then we got a plan in place. That's what I would submit. And we could do a better job with that planning if we're not stressed out. We don't like to plan because it's complicated to assume. We assume it's mental work, and it is. It can get complicated, and it can be mental work. If you're working with the wrong lawyer, the wrong lawyer, in my view, is the guy that talks over your head. Well, those lawyer mumbo jumbo and says something about, well, we should do it this way so we can avoid probate, or we should do it this way. So, and then you go, well, what's probate? I don't understand the probate thing. And so you have to back up and try and explain that, and you use all these legal terms to explain that. And the facility of your brain only goes about so fast, and they're throwing stuff at it faster than your brain can process, and so they've gone on to the next item before you can even get through one, and you're behind them all the time. So that's what I mean about the information just going like this over the top of your head. Don't let the lawyer do that to you. Make sure you work with a lawyer that works at your pace. They will give you information as you can process it. If you don't like this lawyer, get a different one. We don't want to think about death. I talked about that already. And what I'm also finding when I talk about succession and farm transition is that some people don't want to put a plan together today because they're afraid it's going to be wrong sometime in the future. Something will change. Somebody will die out of order. Somebody will have a divorce. Somebody will have financial trouble. We're just afraid that something's going to change and I'll have the wrong plan in place. I would submit that you put a plan in place to avoid having the family getting caught in that catastrophic event, right? And then if you're alive and something changes and you need to change your plan, it's cheaper to change your plan, make changes in the plan, hundreds of dollars or maybe $1,000 or so, to make changes versus a $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 mistake if you don't have a plan at all, or hundreds of thousands of dollars involved, or millions of dollars involved. So make sure you have a plan. If you need to amend it, amend it. Most plans are very amendable as long as you don't put together an irrevocable trust. That's the one no-no. And most lawyers won't recommend that anyway. So there's 3 types of documentation you have to have it to put together for the end of your life, in my view. And I've kind of arranged this way because I want to explain that there's 3 different things going on there. And interestingly enough, I've showed this to a couple lawyers, and they kind of go, yeah, that kind of makes sense. What you did there makes a lot of sense. So the top circle talks about the documentation you need to have it for kind of towards the end of your life. The top circle talks about things like your power of attorney forms. The top circle talks about power of attorney for health care, the durable power of attorney, the power of attorney to have someone take care of your business if you're incapacitated and can't answer for yourself. Who's going to pay the bills if I'm stuck in a hospital and can't do my own thing? That's the durable power of attorney. The healthcare power of attorney can work with the medical staff to determine how that was going to get handled. And then the third thing I think about there is a healthcare directive. What means do I want to stay alive, or what means do I want to be unplugged? The healthcare directive, durable power of attorney for healthcare, and durable power of attorney for business, and then the healthcare power of attorney. Those are the 3 things I think at the top. Anybody over 18 years old needs to have those in place. You hear these horror stories of 20, 21-year-olds that get into a car wreck, end up in the hospital, and now mom and dad are trying to work with the medical staff, and they're not allowed because they're no longer the guardians. So then you have to petition a court. You have to get a lawyer to petition a court, and you have to declare that person incompetent, so you become the guardian, so that you can help with the hospital staff with decisions that have to be made. So make sure everybody over 18 has those documents in place. The left circle, lower circle on the left side, is just the tools that you're going to put in place to make sure that your stuff goes on when you're gone. What happens to my stuff when I'm gone? That's going to be through the will, a trust, or an LLC typically. There's other structures out there. There's other things that you can use, but typically those 3 will cover a lot of us in agriculture. The third circle is what we don't do a good job of. If you're lucky enough to have someone come to your farming operation, if you're lucky enough to be able to pass that on to someone, we have to put the business succession planning in place. In other words, let's make sure that the business will succeed. What I'm running into all the time is mom and dad thinks that since they have 3 children, everything has to be 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. If we don't put other plans in place, what will happen when mom and dad are gone? The 2 off-farm kids will go to the on-farm kid and say, show us the money. And the only way, with the price of poker, with the price of farming right now, right? The price of farming right now, the price of land values and all this stuff, the machinery values, if I make a son pay 2/3 of the debt back to his brothers and sisters without any recourse, how's he going to survive? Probably not. Even and it gets more complicated than that. What if you only have 1/5 or 1/6 because there's 6 kids and somebody wants to cash out? Then you put everybody completely behind the 8 ball. At 1/3 you might be able to make it work, but at 1/5 or 6, there's no way. Now, what I'm talking about when I say business succession, documentation, or planning is I'm talking about what are we going to put in place if we want that on-farm kid, son or daughter or nephew, to continue. How are we going to structure that? How do we put together a long-term lease arrangement? How do we put together a long-term purchase agreement so that they want to buy it from their brothers and sisters? They don't have to pay all the money up front, but the brothers and sisters become the bank essentially, and then they pay them off every year. How can we put together first right of refusals to let that on-farm kid have the first chance to buy? And maybe you put a first right of refusal together with the idea that you have the farm appraised, okay, get an appraisal, and then you say the on-farm kid's going to get to buy that place for 50% of appraised value or 70% of appraised value or 90% of the appraised value. You could even discount the farm based on what you hear. You could put structures in place to make sure that on-farm kid has a fighting chance. Okay? Without that, I think we put a lot of people behind the 8 ball if they have to buy their brothers and sisters off again. And where do we ever get the crazy idea that most of us, if we were farmers, spent the first 15, 20 years trying to take care of our brothers and sisters. Now we're going to make our son or daughter buy the farm again from their brothers and sisters again. Why are we buying the farm back from every generation? And just have this perpetual payment going on. And that's what I'm seeing, and that's what's putting people out of business, and that's what we have to do better at. Sorry, I took too long there. But what tends to happen is we tend to get into what I call the circle of inaction. And I've run this by, I don't have any research study for my talk. My talk comes from working with people for 40 years. Okay? The school of hard knocks, so what I hear on the street. That's where my talk comes from. The circle of inaction is very real, and I talk to lawyers and they say, yep, that happens. So people realize they need to have a plan. All right? So they go on to step number 2. I go to a meeting or meet with a lawyer. Good for you. But man, you go around on step number 3, and this lawyer is causing my head to explode. I can't think about all this. I don't want to think about it. And so you go on to step 4, I take no action at this time. That's what gets crazy, just to put it off because it's hard to think about. I don't want to think about my demise, so I just don't. And so what tends to happen is people stick in that step number 4 for 3 months to 3 years or longer. How do I know about the circle of inaction? It happened to me too, right? And so I had the beginning will done by an attorney when I was newly married, or early in my marriage, early in my 30s, late 20s probably. And that will was the I love you. I call it the I love you will. And I don't know if that's incorrect terminology, but it's just what I called you. It just said, honey, I love you. If I'm gone, it all goes to you. And she says, honey, I love you. If I'm gone, it all comes to me. And here's who's going to take care of our children if we're both gone. Guardian number 1, guardian number 2, guardian number 3. Okay? That's what that beginning will says. But as you start to get equipment and assets and machinery and more assets and more land and all that sort of thing, you're talking about, and then you need to update that will. You need to do better than that. And maybe you don't even want it to be a will. Maybe you want it to be a trust, or maybe you want it to be a limited liability company. The point is, get out of that circle of inaction. The better way to do this is be sequential. I should have a plan. I meet with a lawyer. Family meets to explore options. Options are picked. Succession plans signed. Congratulations. I missed one box on the slide. Add one thing at the bottom. Review plans periodically, or when your life changes. Review your plans, or when your life changes, change your plans if you have to, needed to. Review your plans. Most lawyers will say 3 to 5 years. I think it has to have to do with when you have a life change, then you have to change those plans. Maybe not change them, but just adjust them. Parents make lots of assumptions about how this is going to go with their kids and how this is going to go with their family. And I'm saying that sometimes these assumptions work out great, and sometimes these assumptions don't work out very well. I guess maybe the people where they don't work out are the ones that call me, all right? So this is real. I mean, these bullets all come from conversations I've had. I'm not making this stuff up. You can't make this stuff up. Number 1 bullet says, kids get along great now, and they'll continue even if I'm gone. If I'm dead, my kids get along great. They'll still get along great. Sometimes the parents are the glue that holds those children together. The parents are the ones that settle all the fights. It happened to my family. I have a son and a daughter. I'm kind of half making this up to protect them, right? So I have a son and a daughter, and we decided we didn't need to have Christmas at our house one year, and so then they're late 30s, early 40s, and I said, my wife and I said, you guys decide where you want Christmas. Either house, we don't care. Just not our house. We'll let them decide. And pretty soon they're starting to call, well, Mom, take my side. Dad, take my side. They're trying to put us in the middle, trying to have us decide for them. I'm going, no, you guys figure it out. And they kind of argued about that for a little bit. And so I'm going, I think maybe we're the glue that holds that deal together, and I'll bet it happens to lots of other families too. I know that when my children are gone, they'll want to keep this farm in the family because that's what we do. We keep the farm. We keep the farm ground. That's a wonderful utopic idea, and I'm not faulting it at all. I think it's a very nice idea. However, I just had a conversation this spring with 3 sisters that have farm ground up in northeast Nebraska. They called me up and we did a Zoom. It was before we kind of let loose with the pandemic stuff, and we did a Zoom. And 2 sisters lived in Lincoln, wanted to keep the farm. We want to keep that farm. That's what Mom and Dad told us. You keep your farm ground. The 3rd sister lived in a different state. I don't think it hurts to say it. She lived in California. And she had a high house payment bill, and she had kids in college, and she had, I think, maybe a kid getting married, and she wanted to go on a trip. And she goes, yeah, the rental income's fine, but I really kind of maybe want to sell something so I could get a bigger chunk because I got stuff to do. I'm not faulting the 3rd sister, but there's always one that have reasons why keeping the farm is not a good idea for them. Okay? So as luck would have it, I gave them suggestions on what to consider and what to do and all that sort of thing. And as luck would have it, I had another Zoom with them about 3 months later after that. I think first Zoom was in February. The second Zoom was in May sometime. And it turns out that they were able to figure it out amicably because they kept their family together. And the 2 sisters were going to keep most of the farm ground. They sold a little bit of the ground, plus the mother's other assets, retirement funds, house in town, all that sort of thing, went to the 3rd sister, and they got that taken care of amicably. But you have to think that through and consider your options very carefully about that. My kids will be gone. Let's see here. Wait a minute. Kids will be just have to figure out how to divide. I'll be gone. I don't care what happens. That means you didn't write an estate plan. If you want to start World War III with your family, just go ahead and do that way, because the kids will not necessarily get along. Since I have 4 children, my assets have to be divided exactly 25% to each. Equally, that's the only fair way to do it. This came from this bullet came from a conversation I had. I'm going to Husker Harvest Days next week, and it came from a conversation I had in Husker Harvest Days about 5 years ago. Farmer comes up to me and says, I'm in my last half of my 60s. I'm one of 4 children. I was the one that stayed on the farm with Mom and Dad. I've been there for 50 years since he graduated from high school. Didn't go anywhere, just straight to the farm. And my dad's been gone. My mom passed away back in May. We read the will in August, and what did the will say? The will says the farm is divided 25, 25, 25, 25. I'm pretty sure that one of my brothers and sisters, or more than one, are going to want the money. They're going to want to have their assets given to them. I don't have that kind of cash laying around with the price of farm ground right now. So what are my choices? Well, you could try and go to a bank or Farm Credit and borrow the money, but I guess it's the late 60s. They're probably not going to give you a 20-year land loan. No, I don't think so. And with only 25% assets, you don't even have enough to cover the down payment because most farm and land loans are requiring 30 to 35% asset base down, okay, to begin with. I said, you probably better talk to him about writing up a long-term lease. He said he wanted to farm 5 more years. I said, well, then try and get him to sign a 5-year lease so you can stay farming If somebody decides they want out, I'm not sure what you're going to do, except maybe you're going to get to sell. Because if you own that ground, like most parents pass their ground, tenants in common. And that means they have so many acres, and you each own, in this case, 1/4 of every acre. It's not split, it's 1/4 of every acre. So in tenants in common, if you pass it that way, then guess what? One of the kids could go to a court with their lawyer and petition the court and say, I want to get paid for my 25%. And then you get to sell the ground and everybody gets their 25%, but this guy doesn't get to keep farming like he wanted to, because that was his objective. I want to keep going for a little bit. So it says a couple things. It says several things to me. If the parents really wanted to control that and make sure that son was continuing as an operator, they probably should make sure there's a long-term lease assigned to that somehow, so the kids can't just sell it out from their brother. If the brother wants to have a deal like that, then he's got to make sure that his sisters and brothers are on board. There's communication to make sure they were on board with what was going to happen. And there was another thing that I was thinking of while I was talking about that. The question I would have is, if he got equal amounts, but did he get credit for any sweat equity he put out there? It's a sweat equity credit that bothers me a little bit. As a matter of fact, when I was doing a talk out at Western Kansas a couple years ago, and it was in August of 19. And a financial advisor comes up to me after my talk and says, listen, Allan, we think that on-farm kids should get credit for their sweat equity. And if this guy's been out there for 50 years, he should get 50%. 1% a year for every year they put in out there, their sweat equity. And then on the other 50%, he'd get his 1/4. So he'd actually get 62.5%. So if you had 62.5% equity, guess what? You can figure out how to make that work. You can probably figure out financially how to make that work if somebody wants out. I'm not suggesting that the 1%'s right. I'm not suggesting that, you know what I'm trying to say. Maybe the parents have to figure out what's right and what's fair there and what's equal. If fair is equal or if fair is fair. You know what I'm trying to say? The other thing I think parents have to figure out is that they have to understand that in any of these situations, there's no rules involved, there's no laws involved. The only rule I can find on this work is the golden rule. And the golden rule in estate planning is not what we hear in church, do unto others as others. You know, it's not that one. This golden rule is, ye who has the gold makes the rule. That's this golden rule. That's it. And so the bottom line is, if mom and dad feel so strongly that exactly has to be divided 25, 25, 25, 25, then they have the gold, they make the rule. And you have to come up with ways to get around that or be out of business. That's kind of up to you. Someday, last bullet, someday son or daughter, this will all be yours, unless that's signed by notary public and sealed and given to every party involved, it's going to be a false statement. Because guess what? The guy that comes and talks to me at Husker Harvest Days, his dad said all the time, someday, son, this will all be yours. Baloney, he gets 25%, not all. So, some final thoughts on this. First conversation about any estate plan is when you're done, when you still have a family. I've already talked about that. Don't make that assumption, get that commitment. And secondly, if you're working on an estate plan, mom and dad, grandpa and grandma, the people with the gold, better have their poop in a group. They better be on the same page, because if they're not, then grandpa or the dad talks to the son, the mother talks to a daughter, and now you got two generations warring with each other about what to have happen next. So don't do that. Don't go down that path. Make sure grandpa, grandma, mom, and dad are on the same page first. Don't even start a conversation until those people have that figured out. So be ready for the catastrophic event. The correct web page is going to be cap.unl.edu/succession. But if you go to this website, it'll still get you there. You can still get there from here. Either one will work. I gave this gentleman Huss. I gave him a cap.unl.edu. That's the correct /succession. And if you just get to cap.unl.edu, look under management and succession page will be there. Okay? All right. I started something else in February this year. I guess I'm not ready to retire. I'm of the age I can retire, but I'm not ready to retire yet because I just started this and I got to see this through a little bit. I started a land link in February. And when I was trying to solve two problems, we have young kids up there that out here that want to farm. I got a bunch of them that want to farm. Matter of fact, I have 115 people registered in the system right now that would like to get more farm ground. And I have landowners that have land that don't have a successor. So how can we bring them together? And I'm trying to suggest that we try and do that through something called LandLink, where landowners and land seekers could register at a website. And now we review the data internally with the three of us that are running the program, and we come up with a way to maybe make some linkage or matches. And so far, I have, like I said, 115 land seekers in the system. I have 3 landowners in the system. And right now, I'm not making very good matches. It's not happening really at all. But I'm hoping, well, I think I rolled it out the wrong year. 21 with the high commodity prices. Nobody wants to give up yet. You're not going to find somebody else to farm your ground. You can make money this year, so everybody's going to hang in there yet. But at some point in time, if you want to see your operation stay as its own operation, instead of getting absorbed by the neighborhood, especially the bigger farmers in the neighborhood, then consider maybe registering some land in the LandLink program. And I had brochures out on the table, and some of you may have grabbed them. They give you a website to go to and have some additional information. If you've got questions about that, ask me afterwards. The LandLink application's at cap.unl.edu/landlink, and Jessica Grosskopf is helping me, and she's an educator from the Scottsbluff area. Negotiation. Comments about negotiation. How often do we negotiate? All the time. Used tractor, used car, furniture, anything. We negotiate with the grandkids. For me, it's the grandkids. I want a candy bar, I want a candy bar, I want a candy bar. That's the upper right-hand corner. And, or we negotiate with our family. And so, yeah. And so you have to decide if you're going to be a mean grandpa or a good grandpa. And you have to decide when, what else is going on to whether to make that work. Or if you're right before lunch or in the middle of the afternoon, whatever you can do. And with family, we have to negotiate with family too. It's a part of everyday life. We do it with all kinds of things we do all the time, and I already kind of described that. Negotiations is the back and forth process where we have both shared and opposed views, and we have to come up with a solution to the shared and or opposed views. And so it's a way to reach an agreement. Most of us have been taught to negotiate like what this slide shows right here. Look at the top bar. The top bar says, I want to buy this tractor, and I'll trade my tractor in for it and give you $50,000. That's what, the salesman says I want $50,000 and your tractor, and we'll make this deal. You say, I'll trade my tractor, but I'll give you $40,000. That's your extreme position, right? Low ball. Then the salesman goes, well, listen, I'll tell you what, today I'm feeling good. It's a nice day out. I'll make it $48,000. And you go, hey, I'm feeling good, and I think that tractor's probably worth something, so I'll give you $42,000. This is how it goes. And then the salesman goes, well, listen, if we can't get together on this, I got to get going. I got other stuff to do. I got other people to call on, and somebody else is going to be interested in that tractor. But I tell you what, I'll make it $46,000 for you. And you go, I got to go do irrigation, or I got to go make hay, or I got to go shovel manure, I got to do something. And so therefore, I'll make it $44,000. And then you agree to the middle, $45,000, and shake the deal and walk out. Okay, that's how normal negotiation works. That's the way my dad taught me how to negotiate. We spent 2 hours at the John Deere dealer in Crete, Nebraska in 1970 when I was 15 years old. 2 hours working over $100. That was my dad's extreme position and the salesman's extreme position. It was only basically $100 apart. We worked on that for 2 hours. All right. Before I tell the rest of that story, let me back up and talk about 1970. I'm 15 years old, and what can I do to make money on the farm? Cash. I work for the neighbors. What did I do for the neighbors? I either had to shell corn, or I had to haul bales, right? Rectangular square bales. We call them square bales, but they're rectangular. 60 to 80 pound rectangular bales. What did I get paid for doing that in 1970? About $1 an hour. The cheap guys would pay you 75 cents, and the good guys would pay you $1.25. By the time I graduated from high school in 73, I was up to $1.50, $1.75. I thought I was making money. All right? Now, so go back to the story. We get back into the truck now. We're done making the deal. And I said, Dad, you just spent 2 hours in there working him over and then he ended up splitting in the middle, $50 each way, right? The salesman came down 50 because he wanted us out of there, and my dad said, all right, I'll give you 50 just because we got other things to do. We got to go milk cows. And so we get done with the deal, get in the truck, and I said, Dad, we just wasted 2 hours in there working him over for a lousy $50. He goes, son, where else are you going to make $25 an hour this afternoon? But the mentality is we had to win, right? And $25 an hour was way more than my dad was ever going to make doing any other job that afternoon, even on the farm. It's just a sign of the times and a sign of the way, but we had to win. How does that mentality and how does that negotiation tactic work with family? If we're working on a lease agreement or if we're working on a farm succession agreement? I say it works like terrible and not very good because the family member is going to feel like they got worked over by the guy that had to win. Think about that carefully and think about how you're going to do negotiation with family because it has to be done differently because it's family. It should not be about winning. It should be about how to create the win-win. How do you create value for more parties, for all the parties? How do you get creative? Let me give you one quick example. The example I'll use is from a phone call, or actually a Zoom conversation I had with a family up from northern Nebraska, sorry. Actually, they were in the county west of Cedar, Knox County. Family was from Knox County back in January, February. Younger couple in their 30s, early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, probably early 30s. And they're living on the farm ground. Their dad and mom were in town. They were never really farmers. They just held on to the ground. This farmer actually worked with his grandpa more than worked with his dad. And then the young couple was also had a brother. Okay. The parents now are working in town. They're working on their succession plan, and they're talking about what they could do. And essentially, this couple that's on the farm it's a small place, not very many acres, and they need every acre to make this work because they're doing all kinds of stuff out there to try and maximize their income per acre and maximize the grazing and all the stuff they're doing with cattle and all that. And so he's got all kinds of creative things going on to make the money work and make the acres work for what he's got. And now his brother sticks his nose into it and says, well, I think maybe I should get some of the farm ground too. I should get some of the farm too. This guy can't afford to pay his brother rent, otherwise he's out of business because it's just that tight for them. And so I said, what does your mom and dad have in addition to the farm ground? Well, they got their house in town, they got some retirement funds, they got some other insurance products, that sort of thing, life insurance products. Probably come close to making it even balance if my brother just got all that stuff instead of the farm ground. I said, so why wouldn't your brother just take that deal? He said, the young couple goes, well, because my brother loves to hunt, and this is where he's always hunted his whole life, and he's what wants to have his hand in being able to go hunt. I said, all right, so here's a solution. Here's a possible solution. Think about this. Get creative, think out of the box, do something different. What if your mom and dad went and gave you all the farm ground, and your brother got all the other assets, right? Because they're roughly equal, and you also wrote into the contract or into the agreement that your brother gets lifetime easement to go hunt on that ground. His lifetime easement to go hunt on that ground. You just give that to him. Would that work? I don't know, but it sounds like a terrific idea, and they were going to try it. I've got to get back to them. I know who they are. I'm going to get back to them and find out if it worked or not. They haven't had the conversation yet, as of 2 weeks ago, but I'm excited about that because that's thinking out of the box, being creative, and thinking about how we can make something happen without having to feel like somebody won. Emotions can derail negotiations pretty quickly, and the emotions I worry about are these 5. I went to a workshop on negotiation, and one day of the workshop, the whole day, just talked about these 5 emotions. That's all it talked about. And so I'm just trying to summarize this very quickly. Appreciation. All the people wanted is to be appreciated. Are they being listened to? We have to show sincere appreciation to who we're conversing with. Affiliation. Are we treating the people we're working with as family members or colleagues, or are we treating them as adversaries? That whole I've got to win thing with negotiation. So don't treat them with proper affiliation. And then autonomy, status, and role. The autonomy, free to make decisions, status, or being treated as inferior given recognition, and role, are you fulfilled with the role you have? Autonomy, status, and role. Us old white guys are unfair to the younger generation, mostly because we don't think they've paid their dues. And we're unfair to all women because they're women. They don't make good decisions. And so young women, we particularly put 2 strikes against them. Old white guys do. So be careful about autonomy, status, and role, and treat everybody in your family with proper respect given these conditions, these emotions. There's a lot more, obviously, if I went through a whole day of training, there's a lot more that can go with that, but I'm trying to hit the highlight. Again, yeah, all right. This is just a slide giving us some other ideas or tips to consider. We probably won't take time with that. I want to get to my lease provision agreement and then give you guys a break. Lease provision agreements or lease provision management is something I feel strongly about. I think we have to consider carefully how we're setting up our leases. Be sure you have your leases in writing. A lease that's a verbal agreement or handshake agreement should be terminated and you should get it in writing. I'm just telling you that. Very important that that's done. If you're going to terminate a lease, a handshake or verbal agreement lease, you had to do that by September 1st. We're about 7 or 8 days late with this, 9 days late with this meeting. And if you're going to do it legally and with complete force of law. Yes, sure. What's your question?
If you have a verbal lease, and you have, say, cash rent of $200 or $500, whatever, if you haven't notified your tenant, it's the same next year, right?
If you haven't notified them by September 1st, they get the lease for another year at that same rate unless you've notified them something different. However, if you go to your tenant and say, hey, we need to modify the conditions of the lease, I want to bump the rent $10 an acre or whatever it happens to be, or reduce the rent by $10 an acre, well, the tenant will never fight that. They'll take the reduction. But they could choose to fight the increase. They could choose to say, no, you didn't let me know by September 1st. That means that my lease is in effect, right, for the next year. But then guess what happens next year? They lose the lease because you're going to terminate them because they didn't work with you. All right? I had a situation where brother-in-laws were renting from brother-in-laws, right? A brother-in-law was renting from the other brother-in-law. The wives were sisters. And the brother-in-law farmer was renting from his brother-in-law, the non-farmer. The non-farmer comes to him in the middle of October, right after harvest, and says, I'm going to do something different next year. I don't want you to farm my ground. The brother-in-law could have said, no, you didn't let me know by September 1st. It was a handshake. You didn't let me know by September 1st. I get to farm it one more year until you give me proper notice. He could have done that. But then what has he done with the family? So I got that question, right? It came to me. I said, well, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm probably just going to walk away because I want my wife and her sister to get along. And so whatever people agree to is fine, but if somebody wants to be a sticky wicket about it, then you have to follow the rule of the law, and that's what I have up on the screen. Does that make sense? Thanks for the comment or question. So when you have a written lease, Jim will give you the website to go to get a written lease. But you have a written lease, then make sure you always have in there when it starts, when it ends, and if it's going to be allowed to roll over, and if you're going to allow for negotiation. Let's say you gave somebody a 3-year or 5-year lease. But we're going to negotiate on when we're going to redo the lease. That's the bottom bullet here on the screen. When will it be renegotiated? It probably isn't at the end of 3 or 5 years. It's probably going to be renegotiated, especially on a cash lease, maybe a little bit every year, up or down, or leave the same. And what I say for that is make sure that you set up your lease so that you always renegotiate it about the same time. Because if you don't, and the prices are low, heading up, like they were last year, when will the tenant want to renegotiate the lease? Right away. When will the landlord want to renegotiate? Right before March 1st. If the prices are heading the other way, when will the landlord want to renegotiate the lease? Right away. When will the tenant want to renegotiate the lease? Right before March 1st. And so you should probably define when you're going to renegotiate leases so that nobody feels like they're getting the screws put to them a little bit. They're not being treated equitably. Maybe there's no such thing as fair. Your definition of fair and my definition of fair is two different things, so we have to be careful about that. Here's some other things I think you should consider for a lease, in addition to some of that stuff on starting and stopping and when you're going to give people notice. Phosphorus is one thing I think we got to think about, especially in these high dollar leases, because if you have a high dollar lease, it's only for a year or two. What will that farmer tend to do? He might try and skip putting phosphorus on, especially if the phosphorus levels are at adequate levels, because phosphorus doesn't come down very fast, but when you have to put phosphorus on, it's a relatively expensive situation. And I know I've had farmers tell me that when they put phosphorus on, they'll try and put it on for more than 1 year, because they don't have to go back and do it all the time, and they'll put on $60, $70, $80 an acre of phosphorus. Well, guess what? If I'm putting on $60, $80 an acre of phosphorus and I'm off after 1 year, have I utilized a lot of phosphorus? Absolutely not. So I think for phosphorus, you have to protect both parties. For the landlord, you're protected with the idea that you can't mine my phosphorus. We're going to do a soil test at the end of the lease, and if it's too low, you're going to reimburse some money so I can put phosphorus out there. And for the tenant, you have to protect them. It says, if I put a big load of phosphorus out there and I'm off after 1 year and I expect my phosphorus to last 3, then you should reimburse me 1/3 or 2/3 of that phosphorus to get that back up to snuff. I just think about that. You guys do what you want. I already talked about mining. Lime should always, in my view, in Nebraska, lime should be a landlord expense. However, we've had lots of situations where the tenant just starts to put it on in certain neighborhoods. And by the way, on the leasing agreements, what I find is I go and teach this around Nebraska. Every neighborhood's different. Every neighborhood tends to do things just a little bit differently. So you have to do what your neighborhood does, not necessarily what I say. There's no laws on this. There's no rules on this. It's just what you hear. And for lime in my book is always a landlord expense because it's a long-term expense typically. You expect the lime to last 10, 15 years typically in eastern Nebraska. When you put lime out, so it's a long-term deal. It should be a landlord thing. If the tenant put it out there, and he expects it to last 10 years and he's off after 5, then you should be willing to reimburse him part of the cost of that lime. It used to be really cheap. You used to be able to put lime on for 10, 15 bucks an acre. Now it's more like 30, 35, 40 bucks an acre. So be sure that that's covered or talked about. For soil health, environmental, lease provisions, think about fixing excessive erosion. Fixing some erosion should be a tenant's deal. Fixing excessive erosion should be a landlord's expense. Have that discussion before the whole lease starts. Who's taking care of the non-crop acres, especially the cedar trees and noxious weeds? Who's in charge of that, especially if you don't have a pasture lease? For tillage and no-till or organic or non-organic, what I want to try and avoid there, and this looks like a crowd that's pretty savvy, so I won't spend much time on this, but I get some situations where you have a landowner from Lincoln or Omaha that thinks that we ought to go no-till and organic. And I go, whoa, let's talk about that. How am I controlling weeds in no-till? With chemical. How am I controlling weeds in organic? With cultivation, tillage. So I can't do that. I can't do no-till and organic. I have to either do no-till or I have to do organic. Now for my money, especially on slopes in Saunders County and most of eastern Nebraska, where you have some slope, I would prefer to go no-till first, because I want to keep the soil there. I don't want it in the Mississippi Delta. Follow where I'm going with that? Does that make sense? All right. GMO versus non-GMO, that horse is out the gate. We already got GMO products out there, vast majority of GMO. Crop residue removal, grazing stocks versus baling stocks. I'll make a quick comment about that. I'm okay with cattle being grazed on stocks. If they want to graze, go graze. It helps because you get a little manure out there, but more importantly, you get the volunteer corn picked up so you don't have to worry about controlling that in your beans the next year. That's worth something. Big conversation has to happen about the grazing is if the tenant doesn't have cattle and they sublease it to a neighbor and they collect rent for the sublease, does the landlord get it? Does the landlord get a portion of that rent? Under crop share, I would submit yes, maybe, probably. Under cash rent, I would say no. Unless some provision was put in the lease that says that they would split the payment, the tenant gets the payment under cash rent. Tenant would get that grazing payment. Okay, so just to understand that. Baling is a whole different deal. If I go out there and I grind it all off, shred it, and I'm raking it up and baling it, and I'm leaving that ground pretty bare, I don't like that. Because it's too hard on the phosphorus and too hard on organic matter. You're taking off too much organic matter that's going to help that soil in the future. So only let the bailing happen once every 6 or 8 years, not very often. Not all the time, specifically not all the time. And of course, people should be able to go harvest stocks for bedding and that sort of thing. It becomes an important part of the bedding scene, but just don't let it happen off at the same field all the time. Pasture. I don't have the slide written correctly. If you have pasture and you have a pasture lease, one of the main considerations is to have the conversation about the big 3 disasters that you have in pasture. You should discuss that before the lease starts. The big 3 disasters in pasture is fire, drought, hail. Those are the big 3. Have that conversation first. What happens if we get hailed out and there's no pasture left? What happens if we get a big drought and there's no pasture left? What happens if we have, a fire and there's no pasture left? How's that going to be handled? And what are we going to do with the lease payment? How's that lease payment going to be adjusted? And then the other thing about pasture, of course, is who's going to take care of the fencing and how does that work? And Jim will have more comments about that later. One other thing here is to talk about hunting rights. Hunting rights vary. Under a pure cash lease, in crop ground, cash lease crop ground, hunting rights go to the tenant unless they're held out of the lease. Because it's a year-round lease. It goes from March 1st to February 28th typically. If it's crop share, then the tenant and the landlord better have a conversation about who gets the hunting rights. Who wants to do that? If it's pasture, most pasture leases in eastern Nebraska are 5 months. May 1st to October 1st, or June 1st to November 1st, or some combination thereof. 5-month leases, pasture leases. If it's a pasture lease, guess what happens to every pasture lease? It ends before hunting season starts, right? And so who gets the hunting rights? The owner. The tenant's gone. Cows should be gone. My brother's big on, I got to get the cows out before the hunting season starts because I don't want some person deciding that a cow's a deer and, that's a bad issue. So he gets the cows home. So just understand that. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that about 4 or 5 years ago, Nebraska put in place something called a recreational use law. It says that if I let you hunt on my farm, you want to hunt, I let you say, yeah, go ahead, hunt my farm. And if I don't charge you to hunt on my farm, you go out there and you step into a hole that I didn't know about. You step into a hole and you turn your ankle or break your ankle or whatever. Now you're going to come back and sue me for that injury? If I didn't charge you to hunt there, if I was a good guy and just let you do it, you can't sue me for that. And by the way, it goes not only for hunting, it goes for horseback riding, ATV, four-wheeling, a variety of recreational uses. What's your question?
What if your tenant charged for hunting?
Oh, okay. If you have farm ground, what would the tenant charge for hunting? They could choose to. It depends. So what I'm hearing is different things about that too. Some of the hunting leases are going for, you say $150 or $200 or $250 a buck or an animal harvested. Okay, some of them are done that way, and some of them are done like $3, $5, $6, $7, $10 an acre. Here's 200 acres. You can hunt 200 acres for $10 an acre.
Well, what I intended to say is, what if my tenant charged somebody $50 to hunt, and they turned their ankle? Am I allowed?
You had the deepest pocket. Say the question for the recording is, if my tenant has the crop ground lease on a crop share, he gets the hunting rights unless I hold him off. So he gets the hunting rights. If he subleases that or leases out that ground to be hunted, and now the leasee who pays the tenant money to hunt there turns his ankle and starts to sue somebody, who is he going to sue? He'll sue everybody. Likely, a good lawyer would sue would sue the tenant, and he would sue the landowner, because the landowner is going to have the deepest pocket. That's going to be the biggest pool of money, the asset of that farm.
Well, could you put in the agreement, you can hunt the land at no charge, and then does that protect the landowner?
It should. It should. Okay, do you put in an agreement that you hunt the ground, but it has to be for no charge? Will that protect the landlord? Yes, it should. It should. Also know that everybody, no matter what's happening with your ground, hunting or not hunting and all that sort of thing, just another side note, is that all ground should have a liability coverage on it. So somebody goes on my farm, even if they're trespassing and they get hurt because of some thing I don't know about, they could try and sue me, but I have a liability coverage on that farm to kind of protect against that kind of a lawsuit. If you're charging for hunting or charging for whatever, fishing or whatever you're doing out there, horseback riding, make sure you go to your insurance agent and tell them, hey, I'm charging for horseback riding on my place, and they need to give you a different coverage. It's going to be more expensive, obviously, but again, it's going to give you better, different coverage for that kind of recreational use where you're charging for the use. Make sense? If you got questions, we can handle that later. Corn stalks, I already talked about that. Unless there's questions, I'm going to go on. Manure application. How often and when? And do you allow manure? I like manure. Manure is good. Manure is great with phosphorus especially. It reduces that phosphorus bill like by crazy. I wouldn't put manure out to cover my nitrogen needs because that's going to put too much manure out there too quickly. Manure is relatively low. It has nitrogen in it, but it's relatively low in nitrogen, so if you put it out there at appropriate agronomic rates, it's going to put too much fertilizer out there. So what I'd prefer is that you put a limit on how much phosphorus you put out there. That's how you limit the manure. Ideally, you put manure out there once every third, fourth, fifth year, not every year. Don't put manure out there every year. Remember, my famous story from my time in Iowa was a pig farmer, would always clean out his farrowing barn in the spring and pitch it onto a manure spreader, and you always go out to the same field. For good agronomic production of corn, you want about 20 to 30, at least 20, but 30 to 50 parts per million of phosphorus, right? That's what you want out there in the soil test. And this guy, because he went to the same field every year, and I think he probably didn't know how much phosphorus he's putting out there, and probably threw some commercial phosphorus out there too, while he was fertilizing the rest of his farm. He went in and threw it here. His soil test showed that he had 400 parts per million of phosphorus out there. Okay? And it doesn't hurt. You can't put on too much phosphorus to hurt production. But the deal with phosphorus is it sits primarily on top of the soil or near the surface. And so what happens every time you have a big gully wash of rain? Phosphorus ends up down in the stream and can have fish kills, or it ends up in the Mississippi Delta. Either way, not what we want to have happen. So don't over-apply phosphorus. So that's why you limit how much manure you're putting out there. And don't let it be put out there every year. Irrigation equipment, Jim will talk about. Jim's slides will give you an irrigated rent if you have irrigation equipment involved. Sometimes in Saunders County we do, and sometimes we don't. If you have irrigation equipment involved or irrigation involved, Jim's price per acre, $300 an acre for irrigated corn, for rent, for northeast Nebraska, northeast corner, is going to be assuming that the landowner owns all the irrigation equipment. If the tenant owns some of that equipment, then that has to be adjusted. It's common for some of the costs on equipment and upkeep to be split. Generally, the tenant provides labor, and there's some kind of a deductible on parts. The first $500 or $700 or $1,000 are covered by the tenant. Anything over that, the landlord helps with. But all those things are negotiable, and every neighborhood's a little bit different, so to understand that.
Well, something that you've probably seen in the news, and I know people have various views on things like carbon credits and climate change and all this stuff. I'm not here to preach anything for or against them. What we're trying to do as part of this presentation is at least give you the foundation to understand what a carbon credit is, and what does it mean if I'm an operator, or what's it mean if I'm a landlord, okay? So a little bit of an outline here, and the material that I put together today, you'll see at the tail end of these slides, there were 3 different publications, 2 of which Dave Aiken, who's our ag law attorney on campus, and Alejandro Plastina, who's a farm management specialist at Iowa State, wrote. I felt that at that time when they were put together, they were very good resources. On the topic of carbon credits, what are they? What do they mean for the ag sector? The different types, like where do you sell these things at? That's kind of the background of the first part of the slides. And then the second part is, what are they worth? What are they worth per ton? What are they worth per acre? And what's it mean for someone that's looking to rent land to someone, or someone that wants to rent land from someone that wants to participate in these? Okay? All right. So what is a carbon credit, and what does it mean for the ag sector? Simply put, a carbon credit is when you sequester, when you put carbon below the ground. That's all it is. You're taking carbon from, remember, we breathe in oxygen, we exhale carbon. If you burn stuff when you generate electricity, that causes a creation of carbon. Whenever you create carbon, plants, when they grow, they use it and they put it below the ground. So any activity that can store carbon below the ground or reduce the emissions of carbon would qualify for a credit. And a carbon credit, all it is when you store 1 ton of carbon below the ground. That's all it is. It's nothing fancy or anything below that. Now, as everyone knows, there are different ways to store carbon below the ground, and there are some countries that have done things with building a facility that sequesters it and then they store it under the ground. But with applications to the ag sector, it's when you grow something. In the Northeast and certain parts of the Southeast or even the western part, you have people growing trees in the forestry industry. The ranching industry, we definitely have a lot of grazing land in the state, and maybe where we see a lot of the activity in carbon credits right now, it comes from farming, growing of crops. And the basic idea, once again, is just you're putting carbon below the ground because the production of carbon has been termed by some as a source of a greenhouse gas emission, what people refer to as global warming or climate change. Okay? And I know people have various views on that. I'm not stating my opinion, I'm just stating what it is and why we're doing it. Okay, so how do we store these things? The greatest potential to store carbon is below the ground, and we can do it with many of the different ag activities that we use in the United States. So we highlight some of these here on the bottom set of slides. First thing, growing a carbon, anything that can store carbon below the ground. So things like cover crops, or reduce the emission created from the planting of the crop. So, when Keith Gloon was here in Saunders County, he talked a lot about cover crops. Anything that reduces the emission of carbon or can store it would qualify for a credit. So if you go from an operation that's currently doing tillage to an operation that goes to no-till, that would qualify for a credit. Anybody know what this is right here? It's the first 18 years of my life right here. I grew up with them. And they left our farm after it, right? Dairy cows, beef cattle. Now, the other way the livestock sector has been identified as with the emission associated with the livestock waste production is trying to sequester that stuff. And the greatest potential is in these large animal livestock facilities, primarily in the dairy, maybe to a lesser extent in the swine industry. You may have heard of things called methane digesters. That's another way you can generate it. All the idea is you're changing a practice, and this is a key point to a carbon credit. You have to be changing, you have to be going from tillage to no-till, from not growing cover crops to growing cover crops, from just hauling your manure out in your field to having a methane digester, so it's capturing some of that methane production that causes what I said was climate change, or what people term as climate change. It has to be a change in the activity. So if I'm a good farmer that already does no-till and I already plant cover crops, it's not as easy, and I'll talk about it in a few slides, to capture those carbon credits. It has to be a change in going from one practice to going to one that doesn't have it, or from one that doesn't have it to one that has it. Carbon credits, there are different types of markets. In the state of Nebraska right now, everything, and I think for the foreseeable future, will be voluntary. What that means is anybody that wants to participate in a carbon credit, I want to sell carbon credits off my land, it's all voluntary. There's no requirement, no one's making anyone do any of this stuff. And it's the storing of 1 metric ton of carbon below the ground. I think I said ton, but it should have been metric ton. And there's areas of the United States where there's a compliance market. It's required. Parts of California, and I believe in parts of the New England states and the Northeast United States, there's been state governments or regulatory bodies in those areas that require the use of, say for example, the production of electricity. They require those people producing carbon from the production of electricity to be buying carbon credits. Those are where they're requiring it. Right now, overall in most of the United States, it's a voluntary deal. If I am interested in doing a carbon credit, okay, I like this idea, or I'm considering growing a cover crop on my land, and I want to create a carbon credit on my property, who do I sell it through? Well, you'll notice on the bottom of your slides, I gave a website link to all these articles. And from agweb.com, when the slide was put together, I pulled off all the different markets. So a market is someone that you would contact if you'd want to sell a carbon credit. What do you notice? Well, if you know anything about the ag industry, places like Corteva, and I'm not, go with whoever you want if you want to do this stuff, but a lot of these companies are ingrained in the agronomic industry, agronomy, crop production, some of this stuff. Indigo Ag, Corteva, I don't know all of them up there. Each one of these companies have slightly different requirements for what they require as part of a carbon credit. Most of the contracts are going to be for a long period of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. They're going to require documentation. You might have to take a photo. You might have to provide a soil test of your property. You have to prove that, just because I said I was going to plant cover crops and not do tillage, you have to prove the fact, and your soil test would be one way to prove it, that if your organic matter is increasing, that'd be an indication of, okay, I did do cover crops or I did do reduced tillage practices. And a lot of these companies, especially in the agronomic industry side, some of them already have some of these records if you do business with them. So it kind of is ingrained into some of that. All right, so this is probably what everyone's caring about. What is a carbon credit worth? And I'll be saying, if this is being recorded, this was what they were valued at roughly when this presentation was put together during the summer of 2021. Some of what was reported in some of these different articles, Dave Aiken put together, I thought it was a pretty good article on this. They're worth somewhere between $10 to $15 an acre. Some of the companies that sell carbon credits or are willing to sign a contract with you, they might give you a little bit more money for carbon credits early on in the contract. So maybe you get $20 an acre for the first 3 years, and then it goes down to 5 or 10 for the remaining years. This depends who you're dealing with. What is a carbon credit worth per ton? At the timing of this article, is worth about $5 a ton. Okay, so if you're getting $10 to $15 an acre, you're probably sequestering an additional 2.5, maybe even 3 tons per acre. Remember, a carbon credit, for most of them that I'm aware, you have to be changing your operation from someone that is doing tillage to someone that is not, from someone that's not planting cover crops to someone that is. Okay? Yes, sir.
So if you've been doing no-till for quite a few years, it wouldn't qualify.
Right.
Even though you've got the carbon buildup in your soil.
Yep.
It's not adding more carbon than what you're already doing.
So the question is, if you couldn't understand it from where you're seated, if I have an operator that's doing a great job, no-till, cover crops, and has been doing it for a decade, 2 decades, whatever period of time, can I go back and get credit for the sequestration of the carbon? From what I understand, a lot of the exchanges, there are 1 or 2 that will give you credit for past years, but they don't go back more than 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 at tops. That's the one thing, and we talk about this in the last few slides. It is very hard to get credit for someone that's doing a good job already they're trying to target the people that are not doing it to the people that are willing to do it. So if you're no-till, the example somebody said to me once, if you were no-till and then you started doing tillage for 2 years and then you went back to no-till, well, you are changing your operation then. So this gets onto a little bit of a slippery slope and something that I think going forward we might see change. Some of the other companies, Dave Aiken pulled, he's been pretty active writing on some of this stuff. And this was just a sample of them. Some of these people were paying, 10, 20. The big thing is, how long of a contract do you have to sign to participate in it? That's the one big thing, and how do they value it? So let's say you did a 5-year, 10-year, or 15-year contract. What are most ag land leases? How long do they usually run for? A year, maybe 3 years at tops. Allan and I have always advocated 1-year leases, and some people don't like that because they say, well, the landlord will just kick off the person to the next operator, they'll pay more, and we don't like that. We like long-term commitments, but we like 1-year leases because you can adjust the cash rent to reflect a decline in prices, an increase, or vice versa, whatever. So I was getting ahead of myself. What are the issues? Well, the first issue is if you're already doing a good conservation practice, we can't, for most companies, they won't give any credit, or if they do, they only can go a few years back, kind of a retroactive payment in a way. And the other thing is most contracts are for some period of time that's a long-term commitment. Some do not require it for that long. But if you're interested in this stuff at all, make sure you understand what you're signing up for. And one of the issues, well, the first issue we have on ag land is getting away from the verbal leases and going to a written lease for a year. Or if you do a multi-year lease, Allan and I both agree that hopefully you have a provision in there to renegotiate the cash rent to reflect that. And one of the issues are you have to find someone that is willing to sign a long-term commitment if you're interested in doing some of these things. So first of all, what are the other issues with the carbon credit on leased land? Well, how do you generate it? So if you already have an operator, or if you're an operator already doing a good job out there, can you identify a market that will give you that retroactive payment? And what kind of a lease would you have to craft that would be in compliance with these requirements? Okay? And this is a dramatic change from the normal, how a lease is done. And the general idea, if you're trying to wrap your mind all around this stuff, in the ag sector, there are different ways to generate, trees, cropland, all this stuff. So we generate these credits, and we sell them to an exchange. There was that slide with all these different companies. These companies are going to package the credits together into a bigger thing. They're just not going to sell one credit at a time to a business. They're going to sell a large package of credits to someone that needs them, someone that produces energy in some of these states where they require the use of carbon credits, whatever. And the other thing is, right now, is it economically feasible? If you're getting, say, $15 an acre for the next 10 years, is that enough to motivate someone to plant cover crops, to reduce tillage on all this stuff? Well, if corn's $5 or $13 soybeans, the motivation might be a little bit different than if the price of corn was $3. The thing I would challenge you on, and the thing I think that where we might see more people adopt it, if you're in an area that you traditionally have not grown a cover crop, there's areas of the state where we're having issues with nutrients getting into the water table and they're requiring the use of cover crops. Well, if you're in an area where they're going to require the use of cover crops going forward for the foreseeable future, next 5, 10 years, maybe this is one thing you could benefit from and just another thing to sweeten the pot or help reduce it. The other thing that I haven't researched on is if you have any property that's currently being tilled or planted to a crop and you put it into CRP, does that qualify for a carbon credit? Well, you just went from planting it to a crop to planting it to grass. And grass is a great way to sequester carbon. You might be able to top off your CRP payment with some of these carbon credits. I'm not sure, but my guess is it's worth looking into if you'd ever do something like that. So what's our carbon credit markets? What do they look like? Dave Aiken termed it as they're the wild, wild west. There's no rules or regulations by anyone. It's kind of a self-set market. So buyers, sellers, whoever, be aware of what the requirements are and just be aware of what you're signing up for. The USDA, if this act gets passed, back last June towards the first part of July, in the Senate, when was the last time you've seen something in the Senate passed by this margin? Remember, there's 100 seats in the Senate, 92 voted in favor, 8 against. They passed the Climate Solution Act of 2021. And what this is it's kind of they wanted to set up standards to specify what does a carbon credit mean, and set like a base standard. The USDA has done this in the past when they define exactly what is organic, for example. I believe this has to be passed by the House yet, and I'm assuming if the House would pass, I would suspect this would probably get signed into law. It's no requirement, it's not a mandate, it's just setting guidance, or gives the USDA, I believe, authority to specify what some of these things actually mean. So if you're interested in some of this stuff, I highlighted 3 or 4 publications that were what I thought were very well put together, extension publications from UNL as well as Iowa State. And the question I may have skipped over is, who gets the carbon credit payment? Well, who's doing the work, right? Well, first of all, if you're on a crop share, I would suspect the carbon credit would probably get split in proportion to that crop share. You could see someone sign a 10-year contract to do crop share with someone, especially if they're a family member. The thing Allan and I debate about, if you're willing to sublease the corn stalks out for grazing, for baling, who gets that payment? Who gets the payment from the alternative source of revenue from a property? Corn stalk grazing, cover crop grazing, leasing of hunting rights, all this stuff, okay? So with that, we got any other questions on this topic? Yes, sir.
If you're a farm owner who is 80 years old and signs a 15-year contract, that would be a little difficult. And you'd have to have your tenant in agreement with that too.
Yep. So the question was brought up, if you're a landowner in what I term as advanced age, that's a nice way of saying it. I got to remember I'm being recorded. Say you're in your 70s or 80s, does it make sense to be signing a 10-year, 15, whatever, a very long lease? Whatever you sign, regardless of your age, is going to carry forward with the property. Say I signed a 10-year lease. I'm in my 30s. I got hit by a car driving home. It goes with the ground. So it always goes. And it may be beneficial. It may be a detriment to it. The other thing I said on some of these carbon credit contracts, I said they're worth about $15 an acre. Some companies are giving you a set payment rate for so many years, and that's what it's going to be. Other companies are saying, okay, at a minimum, we're going to pay you $15. But the people that we're selling them to, if it would ever become more valuable to us, we will pass it off on to you. So